Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. Before I get into the episode, I just wanted to give a quick reminder that the Kickstarter for New Blood is still going on, so if you missed me talking about it last time, I'm part of the cast for a new queer paranormal TV show that is being self-produced, so right now we're raising money on Kickstarter for both the project that I'm in, which is called Inhuman Beings, and another project called New Blood, which is a documentary series about a group of filmmakers learning about a secret society of vampires, and we're raising money to finish up season 1 of both shows and, get started on pre-production for season 2. So if you want to know more about that, you can go to newblood.tv, or you can just go to Kickstarter and search New Blood. But if you're someone who's into paranormal TV shows but feel like maybe they're a little bit stale or are perhaps annoyed at how obviously fake some things might be on paranormal TV because of the demands of studios, then these shows are definitely for you. We take a really fresh approach to the paranormal, the paranormal investigation show that I'm on. Inhuman Beings is a spin on the sort of traditional episodic paranormal TV show where we go to a different location each time, but we're not trying to banish anything, we're not trying to send anything to the light. We're really curious about the phenomena and are just eager to learn and see how weird things can get versus adhering to the paranormal TV formula. So anyway, again, the URL is newblood.tv, or you can just go to Kickstarter and search for New Blood. And there are a ton of cool rewards for our backers. There's all sorts of different rewards at different levels. So check that out. And the Kickstarter is going to be running until July 9th. So there's still a week or so to back the project. All right, so let's get into the episode. This time, I wanted to take a little bit of a break from the series that I've been doing about the paranormal and nostalgia. So instead, let's look at some of the hauntings of Denton, Texas, which is right near where I grew up. Actually, I just heard myself say that sentence and I realized that perhaps doing an episode about ghost stories from the county that I grew up in is maybe the definition of paranormal nostalgia, but the connections between the paranormal and nostalgia are not my focus here, and this is probably just nostalgic for me. Anyway, I've done a few episodes about Denton, Texas, and North Texas in general, because like I said, I grew up in North Texas, in Denton County, so that's why I keep talking about it. So first, let's review some of the weirdness that I've already talked about in past episodes. Earlier this year, I did a couple episodes about mysterious airship sightings that occurred in North Texas in 1897. Last year, I did a 9-part series about the Goatman's Bridge, also known as the Old Alton Bridge in Denton County, Texas. Denton has tons of stories of weirdness, but the bridge is like the thing, right? It's been featured on ghost hunting shows like Ghost Adventures and BuzzFeed Unsolved. But when I dove into it, I did a bunch of additional digging and learned a lot, not just about the history of the area, but also about how the legends of that particular haunting spread. And I actually think I broke some information about that particular urban legend because I was able to trace it to a couple online sources that people latched onto and repeated, which I think, as far as I'm aware, I don't think a ton of people have made that connection, at least not that I was seeing. So in that series, I look at how the story of that legend spread, how it was embellished online, and how it eventually became codified as the story of the bridge, even though it sort of just came from like a random YouTube video that a student made back in the day. And in that series, I take an in-depth look at the history of Denton, including a lot of the terrible things that have happened there. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about that in this episode, just because I've already talked about it very extensively. So I'm gonna focus mostly just on ghost stories, and this episode will be relatively light overall, I think. That being said, it's worth being aware that Denton has some pretty awful stains on its history, probably like most of the United States. So here's a quick content note that I'm about to talk about in brief some racial violence and intimidation that happened in the area, just because I think it is important context to know. So the KKK did have a chapter in Denton, Texas. It was Claver number 136, and they were very active in the early 20th century. Also, a black neighborhood called Quakertown was essentially taken over and destroyed by white supremacists. While neither of those facts really factor in to the ghost stories I'm going to be talking about today, it is important to know kind of how the area has changed, what has been destroyed, and with that, urban legends tend to get destroyed, right? Like the history of racial violence in Denton and the KKK's activity there was not super widely known in the area, and actually a major source, or two major sources that I used in my series last year, were two student theses from students at the University of North Texas, which is in Denton, and one of them in particular unearthed a lot of this history of racial violence because for a very long time, that part of the area's history was kept under wraps. And even for a while, Quakertown was sort of forgotten until I think the 1980s. I'm remembering off the top of my head, but for quite some time. And in this episode, I'm going to be focused primarily on Denton Square, which is sort of like the historic area around the county courthouse. And it's just worth remembering that a lot of history has been lost and a lot of history has been buried. So who knows what other ghost stories and urban legends and folk tales and like cultural traditions, etc. from the area could be just completely gone. And that's, to say nothing of the indigenous history of the area as well, before settler colonialism. So much of the history of this place has been buried and forgotten. So who knows how many paranormal things may have gotten buried and forgotten along with that, right? And then also, before I get into the hauntings, a note about sources. For this episode, I'll be drawing from a variety of sources in that, I looked at a bunch of different websites, but I will be relying especially heavily on information that comes from a couple people in particular, both of whom I mentioned in my Goatman's Bridge series as well. So first off, there is Dr. Sean Treat, who is a former professor at the University of North Texas, which again is, one of the big schools in Denton. He has a blog called Denton Haunts and has written a ton of blog posts about the ghosts of Denton, and I know at least at one point he was doing ghost tours of Denton. In addition to using Treat's blog as a source, I also read a student thesis from the University of North Texas called Hauntology Man, which was written by Adam Michael Wright, who I believe was a master's student there. It's like a treatment and write-up for a documentary about Dr. Sean Treat and the haunted history of the area, and it contains a lot of great stories and information. I did search for the documentary to try to find it on YouTube, and I was not successful, but I've at least read the treatment. So if I say something during this episode and I don't give the source for it, it's fairly likely that it came from this thesis, because there was just such a wealth of information there. And as always, these sources and all the other sources that I use will be linked in the show notes at buriedsequelspodcast.com. So then the second source that you'll see quoted in articles about Denton hauntings is local historian and ghost tour guide Shelley Tucker. It seems like she's very sparing in what she publishes online and what she tells journalists, because she seems to be saving it for her ghost tour, or she directs people to buy her book about Denton hauntings. So not as much of my information came from her, just because there was less of it. But if you Google Denton hauntings, those are the two experts who come up again and again. Those are the two people who end up mentioned in a lot of the news stories about Denton hauntings. And I just think it's valuable to pause and acknowledge the fact that most of these ghost stories are being filtered through two people, right? In my series about the Old Alton Bridge, I traced how somewhat vague stories of urban legends can be retold by one or two people online and get codified and spread, and everyone filters things through their own subjectivity, and the fewer people who tell the stories, the fewer points of view things get filtered through, and just people have different social networks, so they hear different things about hauntings from different people, and that can mean that some hauntings might end up being overstated, but probably much more end up being understated or just not reported. Because if only one or two people are telling the stories, they're only telling the ones that they know. So again, I think that is a limitation when it comes to sources. There just aren't as many people talking about some of the hauntings I'm talking about today compared to something like the Old Alton Bridge, which is a very rich text. All right, so a little bit of quick background on Denton. Denton is a college town. It houses both the University of North Texas, which has about 42,000 students, so it's a pretty large university, and Texas Women's University, which has about 12,000 students. Denton itself has a population of about 140,000 people, so obviously while not all the students at those schools live in Denton, a large proportion of the people who are regularly in town are college students. And that's worth keeping in mind. In my series about Fordham hauntings, I talked about how colleges seem to be magnets for paranormal weirdness, and there are a handful of ghost stories about UNT, which I'm sure I'll talk about in a future episode. But in this episode, I'm going to talk about Denton Square, which is a historic downtown area with a courthouse in the middle. It's, I'd say, a very aesthetic spot. There's a lot of stores with neon signs and old movie theater type marquees and lots of cute shops and restaurants. I am also very sentimental about Denton Square because I got married at a venue about a block away from the square. And then, after the wedding, we took pictures in the square. So literally my phone background is my wife and I in Denton Square in front of one of the many haunted buildings there. So obviously I like the area if my wife and I chose to get married there. But even then, there were some signs of the area's unsavory history, right? I got married in 2019, and at the time there was a large, very tall Confederate soldier statue in the middle of the square, right next to the courthouse. The statue was put up in 1918, which was right around the time when the KKK was very active in the area, so it was directly tied to the legacy of racial violence and intimidation in the area. And like I mentioned, I did a whole episode about that called This Way to the Goatman, which you can listen to if you want to know more of that history. I'm happy to say that the statue was finally taken down in 2020, so it is no longer there in Denton Square. But that's one stark reminder of the past that haunts the area, which did prominently feature in the square until recently. There's also a grave in the middle of the square next to the courthouse, and that's where I'll kind of start these stories. While I don't know of any ghost stories associated with this grave, it definitely adds a particular vibe to the square, since it's not exactly what you expect to see when you're there. If you go to Denton Square, you'll see a headstone surrounded by a little iron fence and some monkey grass on the courthouse lawn. It's kind of just in the middle of the lawn, but it's, very intentional looking. There's a plaque, and that is allegedly the grave of John B. Denton, the man who the city's named after. He was a Methodist preacher and a captain in the Texas military, and he died while attacking some of the indigenous people in the area. I believe that he had been attacking the residents of a Kichi village. So after he died, his grave ended up being moved 3 different times. And because of that, it's unclear whether he's actually buried in Denton Square or if the grave is empty. But like I said, having a single prominent grave in the middle of the square is a bit of a memento mori, and it's a macabre reminder of the area's past. There's this point that Adam Michael Wright makes in his thesis, Hauntology Man, that I really liked. It was describing John Denton as a ghost, not like a paranormal ghost, but, something that's haunting the area. And in the thesis, he talks about how if Wright is buried there, his body at this point would be, quote, washed into the Denton soil, so he is literally everywhere. And he points out that he haunts the area because he was an oppressor, and he displaced people, and he killed people, so that's a history that haunts us as well. So that's John B. Denton. Let's talk about Sam Bass now. The outlaw Sam Bass is a Texan Robin Hood type folk hero. According to Treat, there are 3 big different urban legends about him. So the first is stories about where his gold might be. In 1877, Sam Bass and some other folks pulled off the largest railroad robbery in the history of the Union Pacific Railroad, stealing $60,000 from a train in Nebraska. After that, he went back down to the Denton area, presumably with his loot, and he died 4 months later. So the question is, what happened to his money? He received $10,000 as his cut of the job, which is the equivalent of almost $290,000 today. So it's pretty unlikely that he spent that much money in just 4 months. So there are different stories about where this gold might be. Folks have theorized that it could be hidden in a local cave, though in the 1980s it was discovered that one of the caves that it may have been contained ticks that had both Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, so the cave was quarantined. And because of that, people can't look for gold in that cave anymore. But apparently some people still think that that gold is out there. And according to Wright's thesis, it seems that some people believe that the gold is buried in Denton Square itself. So then the second type of urban legend about Sam Bass is tales about him being benevolent and charitable. So there are a few different stories about him being kind to widows. So in one of them, the widow of a Confederate soldier didn't have enough money to pay her mortgage, and her house was about to be foreclosed on. So Sam Bass gave her enough money to pay off the debt and then later stole the money back from the banker. There's also a story about the robbery that went wrong and resulted in Bass's death. During the robbery, which happened near Austin in Round Rock, Texas, Sam Bass ended up killing a deputy, and it was the first person who he had killed, and he felt bad about that. You know, he was a thief, not a murderer, right? So after Bass was captured, he asked what happened to the deputy, and he's told that the deputy died. He then asked the Texas Ranger who was guarding him to give the widow all of the money that Bass had in his pocket and in his bag. And also, this isn't in my script, and I'm remembering it from something that I read last year, but I believe in one of J. Frank Dobie's books. He was a Texas folklorist type. I believe it was in one of his books that I read that there was a story about him not helping a widow, but helping, I think, like a kid, like a teenager maybe. And he basically forced this teenager to switch saddles with him. Like the teenager had like this saddle that was beautiful and it was, you know, his dream saddle. And he was devastated when Sam Bass was like, I'm going to be taking that from you now. And Sam Bass was like, and you can have my saddle. And it's like this ratty, torn up old thing. And so this kid was really upset. But then, you know, after Sam Bass rides away, he looks in the saddlebags and sees that they're full of gold. And so basically it's like actually Sam Bass had given him this great gift in return for this saddle. And again, I may be getting some of those details wrong because I didn't write it down in my script and just remembered that as I was talking. But, you know, there's just a lot of stories like that about him being generous, about him helping people who don't have a lot of money or resources. So that's why he got that Robin Hood type reputation. So then the third sort of legend about Sam Bass is about his horse, the Denton mare. And this is the ghost story. It's pretty simple and exactly what you would expect. But supposedly, people have claimed to see the ghost of Sam Bass with a bandana over his face, riding his horse, again, known as the Denton mare, through Denton Square. I would love to get more detail on these sightings, but this is as specific as I was able to find. Alright, now let's talk about the Denton County courthouse. So like I said, it sits in the middle of the square. It was first built in 1896, and it's a beautiful historic building. And of course, it has some ghost stories. So people have seen shadowy figures looking out from the windows, including a cowboy, of course, because this is Texas. There used to be holding cells for prisoners in the basement, and people have said that they have experienced weird sounds there, and they felt like they weren't alone. And apparently there have been a few deaths in the courthouse, which kind of seems to be the case for any building if it's old enough. But, you know, the courthouse has a vibe. Next, let's look at some of the businesses in the area. So there are a couple theaters, not all of which are still around, but there were a number of buildings that were built as theaters in the square. And There is still the Campus Theater, which was built in 1949 and was notable for being the first movie theater in Denton with air conditioning, which of course is essential in Texas. The theater even hosted a high-profile premiere when, in 1967, Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway came to the theater for the red carpet premiere of Bonnie and Clyde. Later on, it became the home of the local community theater. And theaters always have to have a ghost, and this one is no different. The building itself is beautiful. My phone background is actually a picture of my wife and I standing in front of the theater right after getting married. So, I see a shot of the theater probably, let's say, dozens of times a day for the last 4 years. And yeah, the reason why I chose that photo out of all of our wedding photos to put as my phone background is because the theater is beautiful. It has a huge old school marquee and a tall vertical neon sign on this green fin above the marquee. It's got real Art Deco vibes, and I've never been inside, but it looks awesome from the outside. Anyway, the theater is said to be haunted by the business manager, J.P. Harrison, who started working there in 1949 when the theater opened. Apparently, he was a bit of a prankster, both in life and after death. Most of the stories about him involve people hearing weird sounds and footsteps, or there being, issues with the lights. Folks have reported him moving objects, both in the back offices and on stage. And apparently it's considered bad luck if he has no interaction with a production. So he's the ghost you want to have haunt you. Next up, we have a haunted pizza place. So Wright's thesis recounts a story about a pizzeria on Denton Square called JJ's. I'm not up to speed on the businesses in the area, but I think this might have been J&J's Pizzeria, which closed in 2021 after 24 years because of a rent hike, like every business in America, right? And it looks like there's now a pasta place in that location. But anyway, back when it was still J&J's, a woman who worked there talked about how once she was going down to the basement and she saw a ghost. There's not a ton of detail about it, just that she dropped the jar that she'd been holding and ran back upstairs and then didn't really like to go back into the basement after that, of course. So another business on the square, Pascal Bar and Andy's Basement, which is a bar and concert venue based in the oldest building on the square, which was built in 1877, has seen reports of some paranormal weirdness, including mysterious faces seen in the window and people feeling like someone was pushing them on the stairs. Next up, there's Hooligans, which was a little bit unclear to me if it was still in business, but is or was a bar located on the square in a building that dates back to 1899, which has similar vague reports of weirdness. Supposedly, people have been tripped on the stairs by unknown forces. So again, these three businesses all seem to have stair-related things. Either someone going downstairs and seeing something, or people feeling like they're pushed on the stairs. I don't know what that's about, but it's interesting. Alright, so let's get to what for me is the highlight of Denton Square. Not necessarily in terms of hauntings, but just because it's such a cool building, such a cool place, and also haunted. Let's talk about recycled books. It is a really cool used bookstore housed in what was once an opera house. So the building was first built as the Wright Opera House. It is now on the National Register of Historic Places. The building was completed in 1901 and was constructed using bricks from Denton's old courthouse, which was struck by lightning and burned down in 1894. So to me, that definitely has a vibe, right? Like a building being constructed from the ruins of another building. I always love these sorts of things, and it makes me think of when I did my series about the history and hauntings of Fordham University. I talked about how the most haunted dorm on campus was built from stones that had been, I think, part of the Astor Library previously, which was then torn down. So I always find it really interesting when a building has been constructed using the remains of another one. And, if you believe in stuff like stone tape theory, which is this idea that, maybe things can get imprinted into the stone or the materials in the area and then kind of get replayed like a tape. If you buy into that at all, there are some interesting implications there. But anyway, let's get back to the Opera House. In its day, it hosted vaudeville, light opera, local talent shows, and melodramas. It was so grand that people came all the way from Dallas to see operas there. So that was a big deal back then. Now, supposedly one actor killed himself in his dressing room, but I've only found one not particularly verifiable source that's claimed that, and I haven't done an enormous amount of digging there, so I'm not totally sure how true that is. The Opera House shut down in 1913 because, as I mentioned, there were other theaters and movie theaters in the area that competed with this Opera House. Later in 1918, it became the Majestic Theater for a little while, but that didn't last very long. Local historian and ghost tour guide Shelley Tucker, who I mentioned earlier, said that, quote, its last audience was an all-male group who paid $2 each to witness a prize fight between a local post office employee and a semi-pro boxer from Dallas. Later on, the building became a saloon, a department store called the Boston Store, and Keibler office supply store. I think that's how you say it. Keibler or Keebler, but I think it would be Keibler. Anyway, after that, in 1990, it became a bookstore. So nowadays, the building looks awesome, right? It's this old opera house, and it still, says that it was an opera house on the outside. And the building is painted pink and purple. It really is a sight to behold. It's a delight. According to a Texas Observer article from 2012, which, could be a little bit out of date, the bookstore, which takes up 3 floors, is 17,000 square feet and houses about 400,000 books. The ghost stories here are somewhat vague, but I've read about books flying off of shelves, cold spots, unexplained voices, weird sounds, and a ghost named Emma. Supposedly, customers using the store's online book search database have had their queries get changed to Emma, instead of whatever book they typed in. Students who've lived in the apartments upstairs from the bookstore have claimed to witness mysteriously moving objects, slamming doors, and phantom footsteps. Now here's another one of these wiggly memory things, right? That's not in my script. But I could have sworn that in 2021, the last time I was in Denton, I looked up the hauntings of the bookstore, and I thought I read something about a ghost being seen on the top floor. There's almost like this loft area, and I thought I had read about a ghost being seen there, but I didn't come across that in my research. So I'm not sure if I just missed it this time around, if maybe the website that I read it on is down or is being deprioritized in search, or if I'm just completely making that up. So, take that one with a grain of salt, but I could have sworn I read that somewhere. Anyway, according to an article in Denton County magazine, Tucker asked the owner of the bookstore whether it was haunted, and to read from the article, "Every ghost story you've ever heard about that place is true," he told her. "So you think it's haunted?" she asked. "I know it is," he replied. So that's a fun little tidbit. And just in general, if you're in the area, if you're into paranormal stuff, the bookstore is great for that. They have an awesome paranormal occult section. It's very fun because they have hyper specific labels for different cryptids and UFOs, and there's a lot there. And you can kind of tell when a bookstore really enjoys paranormal stuff, whoever's doing the buying and the merchandising really curated a good group of books, and also just they have almost this nook where the weird stuff is kind of set off in the back, and it's really cool. And it's the kind of place I've definitely been on Pinterest looking at the cryptid core hashtag or searching for cryptid core imagery to get inspired for things I was drawing or whatever. And I've definitely seen pictures of this bookstore because it just totally embodies that vibe. From the way the shelves are labeled, to the way the room's laid out, to the way they've decorated it, and the books they've got, and the fact that it's in this haunted building, in this haunted area. It's a really nice experience going to that bookstore. I love that bookstore. And, if you're ever in the area, you've got to go there. All right, so that's a quick look at the hauntings of Denton Square. Dr. Sean Treat, quoted in that thesis, Hauntology Man, said, "Denton is a very haunted place, but I suspect it's not unlike any place across the American South. And I wanted to read that quote at the end because it really gets at a lot of the things I was thinking about while researching this episode. And actually, if I'm being honest, when I opened up the document that I had for this episode, which I had made last year when I was doing all my Denton research, I was just kind of like dumping links in. And when I opened up the document to work on the script for this episode, basically the only thing I had copied in there was this quote. And it's just a real good one, because as haunted as Denton is, I'm sure everywhere is as haunted, or has its own hauntings that are probably more notable than whatever stories are being told. And while I was researching this episode, I feel like I went through a bit of a roller coaster, where first, I was super excited to dig into all of Denton Square's hauntings, since it's the most historic part of a place that has a reputation for being haunted. But when I actually went through and started cataloging and collecting the stories, I started feeling disappointed. Last year, I spent months researching the parts of Denton's history that related to the Old Alton Bridge. And I'm not talking normal months. I was unemployed for a lot of last year, so I was like spending entire work days, whenever I wasn't interviewing for jobs and stuff. I didn't have a lot else on my plate, so I was like just researching the Old Alton Bridge. So I did such a deep dive on that and dug through so many things, and I found such a trove of urban legends and rumored phenomena that led me to learn more about the history. And then I found so much history that helped me understand the paranormal aspect of the story better. Goatman's Bridge, like I said, is such a rich text when it comes to hauntings. There's so much there. And it really has something special, which is that it started out as a local urban legend, spread through word of mouth, and then it morphed into a couple people online talking about it, and then it spiraled out into something completely different. And after Ghost Adventures and BuzzFeed Unsolved featured the bridge, that made it an even more popular haunt, which meant that more people visited the bridge and had an eye out for paranormal weirdness, which meant that more people were likely to notice the paranormal there. Like if you know to look out for it, you're primed for it, you're more likely to notice something. And then the more people posted online about it, the more places people had to share their stories. When researching the Old Alton Bridge, I scoured the comment sections of YouTube videos, Google reviews of the location, and forum posts looking for unusual personal stories. And there were a lot of places for those to get collected, because there were so many YouTube videos and there were so many places where people were talking about it. And if you have something weird happen to you, you might Google the place, and then if you see a bunch of stuff, then you're more likely to share your story. But not every haunting gets that sort of attention, of course. And I was thinking about what that meant. And I realized that, people might be consistently noticing strange phenomena day in and day out, but it might never rise to the level of them spreading the word. At the most, if they live somewhere like Denton that has a couple ghost tours going on, they might mention them to local ghost tour guides, if they know these guides. Of course, now that the Goatman's Bridge or the Old Alton Bridge has become so famous, you could maybe argue that it has some sort of thought form attached to it, which then might cause new phenomena on its own, which then makes people talk more about it because they're seeing something more consistently. But like I said, I think that conversation about a location creates venues for people to share their thoughts, which then naturally snowballs into a larger body of folklore. And don't get me wrong, I do think that something is up with the Goatman's Bridge on a paranormal level. And the urban legend also resonates on a narrative level because, as I talked about in the series, it functions as a sort of folk news, which teaches people about a hidden part of the area's shameful history. But while I was working on this, I wondered how many other places might have significant hauntings, but there just isn't a well-known narrative for people's experiences to be tied into, or a place for folks to share them. I was disappointed by some of these Denton Square hauntings because they seemed so commonplace in some ways. I loved the mysterious name showing up on the bookstore computer, and I love Sam Bass's ghost horse. Those are fun, weird, unique stories. But some of them felt like they could have happened anywhere, right? Like the sound of footsteps, feeling pushed on the stairs, feeling like you're not alone, a theater ghost. How do these stories differ from, say, some of the phenomena from the episodes I did about Scranton's hauntings? How do they differ from just like any bog standard story of a haunting? But then I started thinking about how folklore seems to slowly spread, and it's always building, right? Like it's a living thing that's always changing. And it seems to sort of congeal as more people tell their stories. And a part of me wonders how many commonplace hauntings, sound of footsteps, a shadow in the window, how many of these commonplace hauntings are just a hint at something much larger, at stories that are just waiting for their time to unfurl. So I'm very curious whether the lore of a place like Denton continues to build over the years. And I'm curious, if I were to check back 10 years from now, how the stories might be different. Anyway, the next episode will probably be about more Denton hauntings. I haven't talked about some of the more famous UNT ghost stories, which seems to be some of Denton's best-known urban legends, aside from the Goatman. And in fact, if you look at books about Texas hauntings, if Denton is mentioned, it's almost always University of North Texas hauntings, not the Goatman. And I talk about that in the Goatman's Bridge series, because that urban legend wasn't as famous until, 10 or 15 years ago, right? Also, while I was doing the research for this episode, I saw something about a pigman in the area that I need to do further research on. So depending on how far I get on that, I might be talking about a pigman next time. We shall see. In the meantime, you can check out the show notes with all of the sources for this episode at BuriedSecretsPodcast.com. I also have a blog at BuriedSecretsPodcast.com where I've been writing daily or week-daily blog posts, so like 5 posts a week. And in that blog, I do talk about paranormal and occult things, but I also look at where that intersects with art and creativity and tech and, stuff like nostalgia. So I do branch out a little bit more on the blog than I do here. So like, for example, this week I published some blog posts about science fiction and cyberpunk fiction and solar punk fiction and kind of like our relationship to our technology, imagining better futures. Like I'm kind of playing on some of the themes that I talked about in an episode that I did last year called On Mylar Balloons and Forgotten Futures, about how imagination is essential to being able to improve the world, and how folks who are into the paranormal have demonstrated that they have a lot of imagination. So I believe that thinking about solutions and ways in which the future could be positive is like a good use of people's time in the paranormal. So anyway, I was talking about some of that this week. So if you're like a sci-fi person or like someone who's into tech as well as the paranormal, all that stuff might be of interest to you. And also, a few weeks ago, I tallied up how much I've written so far in blog posts. And since March of this year, 2023, I've published like 105,000 words on my blog, which is like the length of like a kind of long book. So if you're into paranormal stuff and you want some stuff to read, I have a lot of blog posts on there. And if you prefer getting like an email newsletter, I also have it available on Substack. It's just like BuriedSecretsPodcast.substack.com. All right, what else have I got to plug? Like I mentioned earlier, the New Blood Kickstarter is still going on. Go to newblood.tv or just go to Kickstarter and search New Blood for more info on that. I'm really excited about this project. I'm really excited for it to go out into the world and for people to see it. So if you're able to, please consider backing the project. But if you're not able to, please spread the word. That is incredibly helpful as well. All right. Next time, like I said, I'm probably going to be talking about Denton again. So look out for that. And thanks so much for listening.